So Bondrewd the novel, aka the Sovereign of Dawn, is about the worst white whistle holder of them all, being that he's the literal definition of what it means to be a mad scientist. You see, Bondrewd, while being a researcher who has discovered some of the Abyss's biggest and most terrifyingly important mysteries, has often done so by undertaking some of the most illegal and gruesome experiments and activities known to man. Some of these activities include, but are not limited to, selling artifacts and information, developing dangerous drugs, and even experimenting on living humans, with children of course being his preferred test subjects. Now we first find out about Bondrewd by another white whistle holder named Ozen, who's just as terrifyingly important and dangerous as he is, just in her own way. Now when she speaks of Bondrewd, she basically warns us and Riko that while she's dangerous and creepy, she's nothing when compared to Bondrewd, who's far more cruel and goal-oriented than she'd ever be. But we'll dive deeper into all of that and Ozen's character entirely later on in this video, so stay tuned for that. But now it wouldn't be until we meet and learn about Nanachi and Mitty that we truly understand the lengths that Bondrewd is willing to go to just to learn a little more about the mysteries of the Abyss. For see, as many of you are likely aware, it was him that's sending the two of them to the 6th layer of the Abyss and then instantly pulling them back up to the 5th that caused the two to be forever disfigured into absolute monsters, with Nanachi growing fur all over her body and Mitty losing pretty much every ounce of humanity that she ever had. But what's more cruel than this scene and the fact that they were placed in the experiment to begin with is that after they returned to that 5th layer, Bondrewd exclaimed in joy and excitement about how well the experiment actually went. For you see, in the efforts to learn how to conquer the curse of the Abyss and what it really is that transforms those who descend and remerge out of it into disfigured freaks, he's sacrificed the lives of orphans and delvers everywhere, all in the hopes of learning how to prevent this curse. And it's actually in this effort that he did learn how to actually do that, and that it's actually love and sacrifice that is the key. You see, according to him, it's the love of one who's willing to risk everything for the object of that love, and the sacrifice of the other who's willing to take on the burdens of the Abyss so that the other one doesn't have to. Except this still turns both of them into a Narahate, which is basically a person who has survived the 6th layer's curse after ascending back to the 5th layer. However, normally after doing so you would lose your humanity in the process. Except if you follow the rules of the experiment, you would see that only one of them actually loses their humanity, which in this case was Mitty, which means it's entirely possible that with love and sacrifice, one can descend and remerge out of the 6th layer without losing their humanity at all. However, after all this, Bondrewd didn't stop, and continued to use Nanachi to befriend any and all orphans that came around, so that he could then use them for future experiments, which of course does also raise a lot of questions around his own humanity, with the main being if he actually has any left inside of him at all, because his actions towards these kids would make you think otherwise. But I guess that's also what's most interesting about his character. For you see, he actually loves each and every one of these kids that he experiments on. And it's only because he deeply believes that love is something worth sacrificing that he's even able to research on these kids at all. But now with that said, I also remind you that while he appears to be irredeemable and his actions inhumane, they aren't truly the actions of a sane individual, and are in fact the actions of someone who's had their mind and heart warped and altered by the Abyss itself. Which in turn, as deciphered by Riko later on, is why his white whistle, which is normally made up of the sacrifice of a loved one, is actually made by his own sacrifice of love and desire, which obviously in itself just highlights more about his warped nature and concepts on what love actually is. And remember, all this is before I even dive into and explain Prushka's story. A story of a man who saved and raised a disfigured child in the Abyss before, like everything else in his life, he sacrificed for the sake of his research, turning her from a pure innocent child who dreamed of adventuring with her friends into another of his cartridges, which are basically just specialized packages that are made in the Edo front to make it possible for Bondrewd to lure to the 6th layer and return to the 5th. Now, it was only due to her devotion to Bondrewd that she was able to take on the curse of the Abyss so that Bondrewd could receive the blessing. However, despite this, her desire to join Riko on her adventures was so great that that was all she thought about while receiving the curse, which also in turn transformed her into a life-affirming stone, which Riko then took as her white whistle. But we'll explain much more about that later on when we get to the Riko section. Now, after transforming into his final form and receiving the blessing from the Abyss, Bondrewd fights with Reg and is eventually defeated. However, despite this defeat, Bondrewd, who has just been revived by the Soaholic, decides that instead of attacking them once again, to actually congratulate Nanachi and the others on being able to descend further into the Abyss than he was ever able to do himself. Which I guess is just that proud dad side of him that he will always have for Nanachi and the other kids. That is, before he sacrifices them once again. So yeah, that is Bondrewd, the sadistic white whistle holder who sacrificed everything and everyone only to remain stuck in the 5th layer. Up next we have Lyza, the Sovereign of Annihilation. And a woman so badass she was able to give birth in the depths of the Abyss, bring her child back up to the surface, and return for more action. Like, does that not just sound like the most badass thing that you've ever heard? Now you see, Lyza started out her journey as Ozen's disciple after pestering her over and over again to become her mentor, before eventually proving herself to be extremely talented as a delver, and then quickly rising through the ranks and becoming a black whistle by her teens, and then eventually catching up to her mentor as a white whistle by the time she was even a young adult. To which then she alongside Ozen together dived deep into the abyss as two white whistles, together leading countless expeditions and finding extremely important artifacts. Now over time, word of her achievements would spread and she would become a famed figure in the world of Made in Abyss. But then at some point along the way, she got married to a guy called Torka, and eventually got pregnant with his child. But at that time, she was also tasked with a mission to go and retrieve a special grade artifact called the Unheard Bell, which was hidden deep within the 4th layer of the Abyss. Now during that adventure, they were attacked by every manner of delver and creature that you can possibly imagine, with Torka eventually dying as a result. But then to make matters worse, with all this stress and sadness, she finally gave birth, while still deep within the Abyss. But if that wasn't bad enough, it turned out that her newborn baby was actually a stillborn. And if it wasn't for the quick thinking of Ozen, who used her cursed warding box to put Riko inside, Riko most likely would have stayed that way. Now the newly mother Lyza and Ozen took the child to the surface, before returning back to the Abyss to settle her unfinished business. But then at some point along the way, she finally reached an extremely deep point in the 7th layer of the Abyss, which is deeper than any reports have ever gone. But then around Riko's 8th birthday, she received her mother's white whistle, which was only meant to be given to her at the time of her death. However, after speaking with Ozen and a brief acknowledgement by the character Bondrewd, it would appear as though Lyza is actually still alive, and potentially even deeper than both the 6th and 7th layers. Which of course is the reason behind Riko's entire journey and the adventure that has led us to the making of this video. But again, we'll explain all about Riko's own journey later on down the line. Up next, we have the briefly mentioned mentor of Lyza, Ozen, aka the Immovable Sovereign. Now Ozen is not only considered the strongest white whistle of them all, but also believed to be the longest lasting white whistle to ever exist, having had it for the last 50 plus years of her life. And like we mentioned before, she was also the woman who trained the famed Lyza, who is arguably the best white whistle to ever exist. Now after meeting Riko many years after her birth, she'd keep her promise to Lyza and would reveal the true story of Riko's own birth to her, noting how after she came out of the cursed warding box, she tried crawling towards the center of the abyss, almost as if it was calling out to her, which aside from being incredibly creepy, does raise some important questions on whether or not what came out of that box was truly a blessing of the abyss or one of its curses. But I'll leave that to somebody who's much more qualified to figure out. Now at some point along the way, she became the guardian of the Seeker camp and the commander of the delving team known as the Subterranean Bandits, and eventually even became the mentor of this blue-haired girl. But both of them really aren't all that important to the main story, so let's just move right along. Now Ozen's strength is second to none, and she is potentially the strongest that we have seen in all of Made in Abyss. And there's actually a very good reason for this. It's because attached to her arm is over 1,000 ancient pins, with just a single one of them being said to have the power to grant you 10-fold your starting strength. Which is also why Reg, even with his incredible power, was no match against her, and was just thrown around the place like he was next to nothing. But now while her actions seem harsh and she does come off as a bit of a bitch, she actually has a very good reason for doing all of this. It was because she was trying to repair both Riko and Reg for the adventures that they had ahead. Because she knew, as you've already seen with characters like Bondrewd, the abyss is filled with evil people and monsters that if you're not ready to face them when the time comes, will only result in your death. Meaning that potentially underneath that cold exterior sits a heart made of gold. Or potentially just bronze. But now, not much more is truly known about her character as of yet, so I'm just going to move right along to our next white whistle on the list, which is Srajo the Mysterious, aka the Sovereign of Mystery. Now Srajo is one of the white whistle holders who's honestly potentially forgotten more about the abyss than many of us will likely ever know. She's mysterious and rash, but also extremely attractive when that Plague Doctor mask is off. And the fact that she just walks around the 6th layer of the abyss like it's Central Park just goes to show her carefree attitude towards all things abyss related. She has a team made up of Jozus, which are basically those born as Narahate, which are essentially creatures that shouldn't even exist in the known world. Together they go by the team name Hail Hex, whose goal is to pursue the priestess and uncover the secrets around the Song of the Hariomari, as well as to dive to the deepest levels of the entire abyss. But now, although she may be a bit of a ditz at times and someone who likes to smile and just have fun, this doesn't mean that she's a pushover by any means. As when she met with Bondrewd in the past, she was ready to throw hands with him right away. And although we never actually seen that fight take place, the fact that she made it to the 6th layer like she wanted probably means that she likely won. Which also likely means that on top of everything else, she's potentially even stronger than Bondrewd himself. Pre-blessing, that is. But now what's most interesting about her character is just how much of a mystery all this knowledge that she has on the Abyss actually is, with almost every single word out of her mouth leaving us questioning everything that we thought we knew about the Abyss itself. Whether that be some information about souls or just the use of her white whistle, it's all confusing and incredibly intriguing. Which I guess is kind of the description that I give to this series as a whole. Confusing, but incredibly intriguing. But now, like I said, little more is truly known about her as of right now, and to avoid future spoilers for anyone who hasn't read the manga, I'm just going to leave her breakdown as it is right now, and move right along to Riko, the main character of the story and the newest white whistle added to the group. Now, she hasn't got a special name like the others just yet, but many like to call her the Reborn, the Unbroken, the Innocent, or my personal favourite, the Devourer of Rice Balls. Now, I'm sure she doesn't need much of a breakdown, being that she is the central character of the entire show, but for the sake of the video, I'll give her one anyway. So in the beginning, like we said earlier, she was born dead, and was actually revived by use of the cursed warning box. She was then brought to the surface by her mother, who then left her to be raised in the Bondrewd orphanage, which is where she eventually meets her adventuring buddy, Riko, who's a mysterious robot boy that's completely immune to the curse of the Abyss and someone who's often referred to as the treasure of the deep. Together they adventure deep into the Abyss to find Riko's mother, Lyza, who's the white whistle that we mentioned earlier. She's a carefree and quite naive girl who, unlike many of the other white whistle holders, completely refuses to sacrifice and risk the lives of anyone in her party. Which, while that makes her appear all good-natured and kind, does often leave her open to manipulation. Which is kinda what happened with both Bondrewd and Ozen. But I guess Ozen's reasons turned out to be good in the end, so I guess it's okay. But now, aside from being totally naive, she's actually incredibly smart and intuitive in all things regarding to the Abyss, and can almost identify most if not all the items that she pulls out of the Abyss on appearance alone. And being that she achieved and gained her white whistle at only the age of 12, she's also ranked as the youngest white whistle that we know of in history, which I'm sure would make Mommy Annihilator very proud, if anyone knew exactly where the hell she was. Oh, and she's also always been presented with this weird connection to the Abyss, being that from the moment of her birth she crawled straight towards it, almost as if it was either calling out to her or she was just trying to return home. It's hard to say for certain at this time. But what is known, however, is aside from potentially her mother, who appears to be deeper in the Abyss than even we know of as of right now, she's potentially the most important connection that we have to discovering the secrets that await at the bottom of the Abyss itself, which I can't lie has me incredibly excited to see what awaits for her character in the future. So yeah, that's Riko the Devourer. Up next we have Wakuna the Chosen, aka the Sovereign of Guidance, and the old man that as of right now we know next to nothing about. But I'll break down everything I can and hopefully will gain some idea on what kind of character he actually is. So Wakuna is apparently a white whistle holder and an old man, who is said to be able to travel to and survive the 6th layer of the Abyss on his own, which like we mentioned earlier is something Srajo needs an entire team of Narahate to do, which instantly just tells us that this is one badass motherfucker. But now it is also said that he made his last dive into the Abyss around the same time that Riko reached the Edo front, and did so with very little difficulty and effort, meaning he's either incredibly strong and had no trouble dealing with what awaited in front of him, or he's just incredibly slick with it and a master of stealth. Either way, both he and Riko are currently on the 6th layer of the Abyss, meaning a meeting between the two could eventually await in the very near future, which would also work to be a meeting between the oldest and the youngest white whistle holders of all time, which I can't lie sounds incredibly interesting. Like, can you imagine the things this old man could tell us about the Abyss? Like, I reckon the things he's seen would scare even the likes of Ozen herself. But now, like I said, that's about it for what we can clearly say about his character as of right now. I know it ain't a lot, but to say anything else about him would be total speculation, which is something I just don't want to do. So now, with that said, we've reached the end of today's video. Like always, I hope you enjoyed and consider subscribing for more. But for now, that's going to do it for me in this one. I do really hope you have a great day or night wherever you are, and peace.